Welcome, everyone, to this special edition of the Doorstep podcast right after the U.S. midterm elections. I'm your co-host, senior fellow at the Carnegie Council, Nick Gvosdev.
And I'm Tatiana Serafin, also senior fellow here at Carnegie. Very, very excited about a special collaboration we want to share with our listeners. We have here today Scott Anderson and Alan Rozenshtein from Rational Security, their weekly roundtable podcast, which focuses on national security issues and a host of other things. It's a really fun podcast to listen to. And we want to hear more from them about it in a second, but also really excited to hear their views on policy. So up until still this second, it's really not election day, it's election week, maybe election month in the case of some runoffs. We've been hearing a lot of horse race reporting. This one wins by this percentage, that one wins by this percentage. And we've heard a lot of red versus blue, but I want to move the conversation today into, well, what does this all mean? Specifically, what does this mean at the doorstep and on policies that are important to Americans? What did we actually vote for? And what are we waking up to on Wednesday? Not just winners and losers, but day to day, how are our lives going to change or not going to change? And so excited today, Scott and Alan, to welcome you to Nick and our discussions in this roundtable conversation and format that we're trying out. And just throwing it out there then to anyone, is anything really going to change?
First of all, thanks for having us. I think the question of is anything going to change depends on what the results are. I mean, that's the odd thing. We don't actually know yet who's going to control the Senate. We don't yet know who's going to control the House. I mean, obviously, if either body flips, then any sort of legislative agenda is very unlikely to happen in the next 2 years. At least nothing terribly interesting from that perspective. If the Senate flips, then there will likely be no more judicial nominations, or rather, there will likely no longer be any judicial confirmations, and that will arrest the attempt of the Biden administration to not de-Trumpify the judiciary, but to Bidenize, we might say, the judiciary as a kind of balance to the many judicial nominations that the Trump administration put forward. If the House flips, then we could see a variety of changes. I mean, obviously, and I'll leave it, I think, to Scott to talk about maybe the foreign policy implications, but just kind of two most obvious domestic things that'll change is one, for those of us who have been following and caring a lot about the January 6th Commission, which is something that we talk a lot about over at Lawfare and on Rational Security. There's no hope of that continuing, obviously, under a Republican led House. And in fact, if anything, they're probably going to start a commission to investigate the commission, headed by Marjorie Taylor Greene. That would not surprise me. That does fill me with quite a bit of dread. And then, if the House again flips to the Republicans, you could see some really potentially destructive kind of hardball politics coming out of that caucus. There's already some suggestions that the Republicans might go back to the debt ceiling brinksmanship that we, have dealing with on and off for the last 15 years. And again, of course, also things depend a lot on how large the House majority ends up being for the Republicans. There's a big difference between, Speaker McCarthy dealing with a 30-member margin versus dealing with a 3-member margin. So I think those are just at least some of the domestic implications. And I think Scott can speak to, what a Republican victory might mean for foreign policy issues.
Yeah, sure. I mean, the thing to bear in mind, I think, is that even though these results are not the red wave some people were predicting, people are calling it a red ripple, even a red wedding. I think I've seen some commentators suggesting, I think Democrats have reason to be kind of emboldened and pleasantly surprised about the outcome. And I actually think that itself has policy ramifications for down the road about how the electorate and then political figures are going to be responding to that we can talk about a little bit more. I think to bear in mind is even if just the House flips, and I think that's the most likely scenario right now, it seems that the House will be controlled by Republicans by a slim majority. The House is like a highly majoritarian body. it means that even if you just have slim control, you get to dictate who the chairs of the committees are. And that means they get to drive the agenda in terms of oversight and investigations. Something that House Democrats have been very active about during the Trump administration, and did a lot to, rightfully, in my view, in most cases, solidify the House's authority to pursue those investigatory responsibilities and authorities. And those are going to be flipped a little bit now. Narrower margin make it politically more difficult. It actually, institutionally doesn't make that big a difference. If you control the chair and you have enough kind of partisan fidelity that you can rely on your members to vote with you, and particularly around procedural matters, there's like a very strong norm of doing that in both parties. That's why even slim majorities can still run the House pretty effectively. It means you're going to drive the bus. So we already know what this is going to look like to some extent. We know we've had promises from the likely speaker, Kevin McCarthy, although again, I actually think one outcome of this somewhat underwhelming results for Republicans might be his speakership might be a little more in danger than would be otherwise. But if his agenda probably reflects what Republicans are going to do regardless. So we know he's talking about, we're going to have investigations about the origins of COVID. That obviously has implications for US-China relationship. We're going to have investigations about Afghanistan and withdrawal there, probably much more narrowly focused on the Biden administration's actions, not the 20-year retrospective that Democrats have indicated they might be open to, but no one's really taken any steps towards implementing meaningfully. And then we also know we're going to see investigations specifically about the FBI. We saw the judiciary minority released a quote-unquote 1,000-page report just in the last week or two. Actually, the report was only about 40 or 50 pages. It was in with 9,000 plus pages of 900 plus pages of copies of letters, many of them redundant, that they sent out to various people to beef up the report and waste trees. I guess I don't really know why, but regardless, it underscores that they are really trying to build a case out of not much there, at least as far as I can tell from this report, that the FBI is highly compromised, and the rhetoric around this has been pretty remarkable, basically saying the leadership, the whole FBI has been undermined by what they perceive as, Democratic left-leaning partisan preferences. Something very ironic for anybody who's dealt with the FBI for more than the last 4 or 5 years. That's going to be a big focus of theirs, and they're still going to be able to execute that institutionally just by some control of the House. There just may be some more political constraints on it. And then we can get more into the foreign policy consequences, because, the majority of the vote means they get to run the agenda about what legislation gets votes on the House, how they structure amendments. There is, if they can pull swing voters over on certain items there, they'll have less control on the substance of those issues. But it does mean that the Biden administration may face an uphill battle around things like support for Ukraine, particularly down the road when the authorities that are going to be enacted by the current outgoing Congress for the next year begin to expire, or appropriations begin to run out, and they've got to come back to Congress for more. So lots to dig into there, but even a slim Republican majority in the House, the most likely outcome, has big policy ramifications.
I think it's important that you've highlighted for our listeners why process matters. Often this is where people's eyes glaze over, but as you said, if the Senate flips, not only judicial appointments, but all nominations are impacted by that. And then, of course, in the House, both houses of Congress, control of the committees, control of the agenda, the legislative agenda, what gets moved forward for a vote, what gets bottled up, I think is all very important. And you're already seeing some concern outside of the United States about, is this going to be 2 years of gridlock? Is this 2 years of nothing really gets done? Are we just now essentially in a waiting period until 2024? And of course, the world is moving on. I mean, we live in a dynamic situation. We've already alluded to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, relationship with China. It's not likely that other countries are going to wait around. On the other hand, and I'll pose this to you both, despite the partisanship and the domestic divide, there does seem to be some degree of basis for consensus. Both parties have become much more China skeptical over the last number of years. The narrative that we are in a competitive relationship with China seems more or less to be shared by both parties. While levels of aid to Ukraine might be on the table, there doesn't seem to be, other than a few outliers, much pushback against the idea that the U.S. should be helping Ukraine in its fight against Russia. Do you see that there could be some bipartisan initiatives in foreign policy and national security that move forward, or do you think partisanship, even when there's agreement across the aisle, the partisan divide will preclude that from moving forward?
It's a really tough question. I don't think we will know until we get there. The one thing I think we can be confident is that the opportunity and incentive for more partisan driven behavior builds over the next 2 years. So, first, the legislation that the current Congress has enacted begins to either expire, appropriations get spent down, Congress has to enact new things, and that gives even one chamber of Congress that's controlled by Republicans much more influence once you hit those inflection points. And that's when you'll see more bargaining. Also, other things unrelated to national security, but are still nationally important, like Alan's already mentioned, the debt ceiling is a big one, right? Then you also have the fact that the incentives are going to build, and that's going to depend a little bit on who the candidate is, like the tenor of that, right? Like, we know Donald Trump and a lot of people around Donald Trump had very different views of Russia and very different views of Ukraine until just a few years ago. I don't think all those views, they're quieter now. People don't express them. They don't focus on them. I don't think they've totally gone away, or that, all Republican officials have abandoned them and aren't willing to go back to them at some point if provided the right incentive. I think it is a minority, but it's an influential minority because they have such a strong support base. Although, again, maybe weakened by the kind of lukewarm results of this election. We'll have to wait and see. But nonetheless, they tend to be well-funded, very organized, very motivated, and therefore can bring a lot to particularly House votes where candidates are always worried about being primaried and always need support. And so they're going to have kind of a disproportionate weight that might lead them to be more skeptical of Ukraine down the road, particularly if the economy suffers, particularly if the war drags on. So I'm a little more concerned about support for Ukraine down the line. But, I agree in the near term, short to middle term, next 6 months or so, I don't anticipate any major changes in that regard. But the risk is going to build depending on a bunch of other external factors as well. China, 100% right. There's a lot of alignment here, but there's also strong political incentives to sometimes look like you're being harder or meaner or even more anti-China. And that's what we're likely to see. That's what this COVID investigation they've already announced is going to be about, right? And the angles, the ways you fight China, the parties have very different views on, and they have different policy implications that are problematic at times. I think the Biden administration's, we're going to see tension with the House over that.
Yeah, and I would just add to what Scott said. I mean, I want to draw out the point about Trump and Tatiana. I know that I'm going to try to not violate your injunction to not talk about the horse race aspect of it. But I do think that, and we'll see this more again over the next few days as the results shake out. But I do think that how this election impacts Trump and Trumpism and Trump's role in Trumpism is going to be a very important one. Not just for the political context, but also for these policy issues. Because let's say even if DeSantis ends up being the nominee for in 2024, it's highly unlikely that Trump will, how do I put it this way, be gracious about it. And so because of his outsized influence on the party, and particularly the outsized influence on the party's base, and because, again, the Republicans, although they may have a majority in the House that'll give them procedural control, that still might be a fairly slim majority. They might be very sensitive to whatever nasty grams Trump is constantly lobbing from Truth Social or whatever the case is. If you then inject a potential indictment of Donald Trump, either on federal or state charges, a official run for the 2024 election, I think the scope for the sort of bipartisan cooperation that, Nick, you outlined, and I think plausibly so, about China and Russia and, increasing U.S. manufacturing and, whatever else that actually there's actually quite a bit of agreement on, that might go down just because the politics will be so, generally speaking, poisoned and toxic.
So I want to comment on the toxicity, because I do feel like, especially on a local level, it was ramped up because of what was learned from 2016 and 2020, and it trickled down into just plain mean electioneering on a local level. And in many races, across New York State and, we've been looking at it in some of my classes and looking at some of the ads and the just plain meanness. In one ad, we had a candidate and with Putin's face next to the candidate, and this person's, and it was just with fires and flames behind. I mean, and lots of other things that I won't describe because they were so mean. And I do think for most of those candidates that sent out all these mean mailings and mean ads, they were rejected. And I think in part, it's a hypothesis, and it's not, I cannot quantify it yet. But I do think there's this turn away from this, divisive language and this complete hateful rhetoric. I actually do believe it in my gut. No empirical proof yet, but I think that is leading people to look at candidates more on issues and how they speak to candidates as intelligent people, looking out for their issues. And I think there, if we were swinging the pendulum towards just mean, nasty partisanship, I think I see, no empirical evidence yet, a swing shift back to let's talk like human beings. I respect your point of view, you respect my point of view, and I think this is coming from the younger generations, which are now moving into office, into positions in state legislatures, we just had our first elected Gen Zer going to Congress. That's a first. A tweet this morning that made my heart sing. My name is Nabila Syed. I'm a 23-year-old Muslim Indian American woman. We just flipped a Republican-held suburban district. This is in Illinois. I mean, tell me if I'm being Pollyannish, but I see a glimmer of change in rhetoric, in more going towards let's cooperate. Your point of view is different from mine, but let's find a middle.
Okay, so I'll be the downer on this one. I mean, I think that I think there's definitely a lot of truth to that, and at the very least, I do think that the Republican brand is really turning voters off, and particularly that part of the Republican brand that is, whether you want to talk about it as meanness or just non-democratic, right, in the small d democratic sense. It is remarkable that with a 42% presidential approval rating, record high inflation, and a midterm year, the Democrats, it looks like mostly the status quo is going to continue. Candidate quality does also appear to matter, not just in the Senate, but also in the House. And so, in that sense, I do think that you are seeing Republicans sort of pay the price for their extremism. The problem, though, I think, is that the hold of this extremism on the Republican base does not seem to me to be substantially weakened. And again, you have lots of outlets, whether it's the Times or 538, doing analyses of how many Republican winners yesterday and potentially in the days to come are out and out election deniers. Right now, it's good that in some of the key states for 2024, I think notably Pennsylvania, potentially Wisconsin as well, the Democrats, it looks like, are going to keep the governor's house, which means that they will be able to limit the sort of shenanigans that I think a lot of us were afraid of, and honestly might still occur in 2024. So I guess I would just temper your hope, which I think again is well taken, just with the sobering realization that at the end of the day, Trumpism is still the dominant ideology in the Republican Party, and that's not a long-term good thing, I think, for American democracy.
I agree with everything Alan said, but I also want to put maybe a slightly more positive, even Pollyanna spin on it. But I'll lean that way as being glass half full, in the glass half full camp. In this regard, this is a big defeat for Donald Trump, flat out. That is going to be the narrative coming out of this. Whether it's real or not, the extent to which it's real or not, that's the narrative, right? Because we had built up an expectation, in part because of Donald Trump's and people around him and people affiliated with him with their words, in part because of a huge shift towards Republican-backed partisan polling that was very optimistic. Like, there's big expectations in the election. They've fallen short on that now. this is a big moment for somebody else to step into the Republican Party and assert a different brand of leadership. Ron DeSantis has a very Trump-like brand, but he's also going to face incentives to begin to distinguish that to some extent in the next few years. Maybe find ways to say, I don't have some of the liabilities that Donald Trump brings. I think he's a very politically savvy guy to some extent. Some people would argue, our colleague Quinta Jurecic has argued in the past that that's actually part of the reason why he's not as going to be as effective as Donald Trump, because he doesn't have that kind of animal instinct, to kind of paraphrase. I think she said dark magic or something to that extent. But it is, I do think he's got the kind of triangulation aspect that usually works for a lot of candidates, in a lot of contexts. And it creates an opening for people like Liz Cheney, who has strongly signaled that she may step into the Republican primary to be there, not necessarily with expectations of winning, but to say, hey, look, we need to have somebody in the party speaking about these issues and saying we should not be on the ride to tearing down our democracy. This is a real important moment for those people. This is the biggest opening those people have had to begin to change who's in control of the party. And that changes faster and more easily than you think, particularly, frankly, when your big hub of support tends to be in the states and the House of Representatives, where you have the most frequent elections, and people just tend to be the most ideologically malleable because they're under the most electoral pressure, right? And so I think this is actually the biggest moment of weakness for that kind of Trump-led coalition, the Republican Party, and that has big ramifications. And that ties into this kind of mean language bit that you're talking about, Tatiana. Like, that is a big driver of this idea that we are right, and we're so right, we can be kind of dismissive and hostile to the other side, derogatory towards them. And then we are so right, we can disregard the actual democratic outcomes. Those things go hand in hand, and this kind of does feed into that. I'm not sure the meanness is as likely to go away as it is, because that's kind of always part of our politics, but it's going to be maybe a different tenor. And it's the anti-democratic element of it that I think might have some of the bigger weakness here, because the two big issues that we're going to see saying what brought Republicans down here, it is candidate quality, which is just a coded term for all these issues we're talking about, frankly, like kind of people who are conspiratorial theorists and have kind of wacky views. And then it's abortion rights. Abortion rights was the number 2 item after inflation in exit polls around the country, even stronger for young people, I suspect, once we break down the demographics. That's been true of polling for the last couple of weeks and months since Dobbs came out. And abortion rights is going to be an ongoing political struggle in our country in a post-Dobbs landscape. You're going to see legislation around it in states around the country. Like we saw separate ballot initiatives last night. And on top of that, it is fundamentally a process complaint. It is people saying, how has a political shift taken away rights that I thought I had, or as woman, not me personally, but half the American population thought they had for 40 years. That sort of process complaint feeds into this democratic norms, and it reinforces them, and they are underlying that sort of conversation. And again, this is a moment where we are seeing democratic norms reassert themselves as an important part of what voters care about in America. They're doing it indirectly, but it's really there. I think it's a major driver of this defeat that we've seen for Trump-backed Republicans really across the country here. I think is the only way we can think about it.
Well,
Oh, go ahead, Tatiana.
I just want to say the one thing, and then Nick, I think that we have to also acknowledge how many people came out, right, in a midterm election. I mean, the number is up to, and I know that we're still massaging those numbers, upwards of 120 million, I've heard, coming out to vote in a midterm election year, unheard of. And in general, America does poorly when ranked with other countries in terms of election turnout and voting turnout. But this was pretty amazing. And the early voting was amazing. The early ballots and people asking for early ballots was amazing. And I think we have to take into account that people in general, overall, my other hypothesis I'm throwing is that we have learned so much from 2016 that our civic life matters, that civic engagement matters, that it is a doorstep concern and an everyday concern, and that we can't nullify that. Every decision that is made in our lives is controlled by government, and the government is people that we elect, from taxes to abortion rights to, and then Nick, I'll let you go, and then I'm going to come back to climate, because I don't want to miss that issue before we leave today.
Well, good. Yeah, that's because I wanted to connect the what next steps back onto the international stage. So, the president has made a hallmark of his discussion about America's role in the world, that part of that is to make the case for democratic forms of governments against authoritarian and autocratic forms of government to try to pull together partners and coalitions. Just again, we don't know the final results. We don't know how things are going to shake out in both houses. But in your opinion, as of this moment, do you think when the president goes to Bali, goes to the G20, he goes with kind of some wind behind his sails, that he is, he has beat back the red tsunami that didn't happen? Does that help him? Do you think that other G20 countries are responsive to that? And just to kind of to pave the way, and I think Tatiana will pick this up, the other question, of course, being that this election, unprecedented numbers of younger people not only voting, but as Tatiana said, taking office. A few days ago, we retweeted Georgian Prime Minister Irakli Gvosdev's comment about next generation leaders having very fundamentally different approaches to questions of international politics. And so maybe the second question, maybe Tatiana, you can build on this as we continue the discussion, which is, are we going to start to see within the US as well a generational change in our understanding of what national security is and what those priorities would be? But I guess my going back to my point, do you think the president gets a bump for the G20 from the midterms?
Maybe. Honestly, though, I think it depends on whether the House flips. At the end of the day, we can make all the statements we want and we can make all the commitments we want, but I think if the last 10 years have shown us anything, it's that honestly, the president's powers in fighting climate change they're not that big, unfortunately, because whatever international commitments he makes, whatever their status is under international law, they mean exactly zero, frankly, in domestic law. Obviously, he has executive authorities and there are things he can do on the margins and he can do agenda setting. All of that is true. But at the end of the day, the way we're going to move to a more sustainable future is through massive investments in renewables, taxes on carbon. I mean, whatever laundry list of policy interventions that you think is or is not appropriate, ultimately, all of that has to be done through Congress. Even quite recently, the Supreme, just last term, the Supreme Court limited the extent to which the EPA and other government agencies can act on their own. So, obviously, it's better for Biden, and I think those political leaders, kind of in the know, who really understand American politics, will appreciate what a victory this is relative to expectations. But ultimately, when it comes down to whether a small Pacific island nation that is currently sinking under the water cares, frankly, it's going to be whether or not the president can credibly commit to American legislative action. And unfortunately, and here this is one of the areas where I don't think there's actually a lot of agreement among the parties. If Kevin McCarthy is Speaker of the House, there's not going to be an Inflation Reduction Act Part 2. And that's a shame.
Yeah, I'll take a slightly more positive take, but I think I generally agree with that.
This is my posture. You're the positive one, Scott. Today, I feel like
taking your half full glasses and I'm savoring every bit of every drop left, even though you dismiss them as merely half empty. No, I mean, in this case, Joe Biden is in a better position today than he was on November 7th. Absolutely, flat out, because a lot of these costs were already baked in. Like, the United States has a credibility problem, and it comes from its internal politics, and it's going to stick with us for the foreseeable future. It's not necessarily new either. We saw the Obama administration try and use a lot of creative international and domestic legal arguments, a lot of political persuasion, and frankly, the kind of international and domestic view that they were going to, the Obama administration and kind of their successors, Hillary Clinton in that particular case, were going to control the White House for a while. That proved not true after 2016, to try and put in a lot of initiatives that did hinge on the kind of fringe of executive power, because they couldn't get Congress on board, but they came up with a bunch of ways. And they were probably right, frankly. If they'd gotten 4 more years of an administration that would have stuck by them, those would have been really influential and had good policy impacts, but they didn't. And even in the best of circumstances, I think people understand now the United States is has politics kind of on the head of a pin. It can go either way in major elections. And so they don't have any ability to really commit to those big ticket items in a meaningful way down the road. Now, Inflation Reduction Act, huge victory, something that came for a long time for climate people in particular. And I don't think it's likely to be rolled back now, especially because President Biden's there and the Republicans might not control the Senate. And because the way it's structured, it is an incentive-based thing. Like if you take it away, you're going to anger parts of American industry. And so it's not an easy thing to roll back as opposed to like new taxes and stuff that have been part of prior climate proposals. Although that comes at an economic cost and a deficit cost and a sort of other things that there are reasons to legitimately, criticize how it was executed from certain perspectives. But those big initiatives, like they're just not really on the table and haven't been for a while. So I think Joe Biden never really had that toolkit. He's got the bully pulpit. He's got, the limited things he can do under his own authority, but after that, it kind of peters out. And now he can come in and at least say, well, you have to be a lot less confident Donald Trump's going to be back in 2024 because look how his candidates did. That makes him stronger, but doesn't fix those underlying problems. That's why, at least in the climate space, like I think the United States, we've seen progress on climate the last few years. We actually have. We're still in a bad scenario with bad consequences, but we've, curbed carbon emissions enough that the worst consequences we were worried about 5 or 10 years ago seem to be no longer realistic or serious concerns. That's progress. It's not the victory people wanted, but it's progress. A lot of that happened in spite of the United States, or in the absence of the United States. And frankly, those avenues, I tend to think are the ones likely to be most successful. And while it's important for Joe Biden to say, no, we want to talk about climate, we need to make sure it's a priority, acknowledge it, put it on the national agenda. A lot of times it's just going to be making sure there's space for subnational actors, private sector actors, and other people to make progress on these issues. And then frankly, capitalize on geopolitical circumstances that might make them easier, like the fact that oil dependency is undermining us in Ukraine and making us have troubling relationships with Saudi Arabia, things like that, that there might be opportunities to tack away from carbon reliance. But, I don't know if making it a big electoral issue is the way to move anything forward now, because I'm just not sure there's enough confidence that he would be able to deliver something at the best of circumstances. Hopefully that changes one day, but right now I don't think it does.
Oh, I love your lead into my question, because this is also what we've been talking about here at the Doorstep. The fact that, first of all, I say this all the time, that the midterms are more important than the presidential election because of this very issue that you both have stated. It is the Congress, it is the House, it is at state levels where we see action on so many of these projects, especially climate. And in here in New York State, where I am, we just passed a $4 billion Environmental Bond Act, which a lot of people were skeptical about, but was, a really big issue here in New York State. California is the 4th biggest economy in the world, moving a lot on climate. And I think that what we're seeing is the states are taking over foreign policy in a way we've never seen it before. And I want to kind of get your understanding and look at that, post these midterms. Are states just going to continue to take more action as this debate over what federal rules and what the federal government should and shouldn't be between the Dems and the Republicans continues?
Yeah, so it's an interesting question about states and their role in foreign relations, and there's a whole cottage industry, within foreign relations scholarship and in scholarship around foreign relations law about this. Obviously states are quite limited in the sort of foreign policies they can have. I mean, they are in many constitutional ways just restricted from doing so. So it's not that they can take official positions, but obviously some of the actions that they can take obviously can have these repercussions. I mean, the standard example that's usually trotted out is California, which both through practice, and because it's such a big market and because it has the special permission from the EPA, can set its own, emission standards for cars, for example. And people talk about the California effect. I do expect that, to the extent that there's gridlock at the federal level, there will be more state-led initiatives. I don't think it's that the state-level initiatives will themselves have specific kind of international effects, but rather that, and you see this often in American history, when the federal government is deadlocked, the states can play their laboratories of democracy role, and you can get changes in American policy that flow in a bottom-up way from the states to the federal government, and then from the federal government, obviously, then that has a major impact on the world, because of the size of the United States and its power, prestige, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, I don't know if I have much to add to that. I think that's fairly astute. I mean, we see in a moment when you see the federal government paralyzed, states play a more central role in all sorts of policy areas, both domestic and international. And some will say that's part of our constitutional design. I don't think realistically that's actually been part of our constitutional design through most of the 20th century. It was a feature maybe a lot earlier in American history, before we had such broad ideas about federalism and federal government. But it is still an underlying kind of safety net of policy. It's part of the laboratory of democracy. I think that's a term that sometimes gets used in too celebratory a way. You don't always want things in a laboratory. Sometimes laboratories aren't the most efficient way to do things, but it does lead to a lot of experimentation, and it gives opportunities for people to live lifestyles and live in policies they feel represent them in important ways. Abortion rights, again, I think really has become really important, and why the states are going to be a big focus of that for the foreseeable future. So yeah, we are seeing like a little bit of a resurgence of the states precisely because the federal government is so paralyzed around these big legislative issues, and then being reinforced to a substantial extent by a Supreme Court that seems inclined to limit federal regulatory authority, at least without more affirmative congressional ratification than it really is inclined to produce. Like, we're seeing the Supreme Court curb a lot of the broad statutes that the federal government has relied upon to regulate things and pursue different types of action for the last several decades. So that combination just puts a lot more on the states. The problem is a lot of problems can't be effectively addressed by the states at scale. And there are a lot of trans-state issues, just as there are transnational problems, that you really need an effective federal government to deal with. So we're going to see problems arise from this. But nonetheless, there is a little bit of a saving grace that they can play a central role. And on things like climate, the fact that you have the state of California, a major global economy in its own right, taking a leading role in that, yields benefits.
And I also think, we, as a whole, when we're looking at the federal government and our role in the world, post-election, what the world is thinking of us, let's not forget that Britain just went through complete chaos in its prime minister ship, and it's still continuing. And so, as we continue to look at where the House is going to end up, where the Senate's going to end up, I continue to leave off with a positive, hopeful perspective on what's going to happen and positive change that's going to happen. And I look forward to continuing our conversation with you both, and Quinta as well, when we go over to rational security.
And we're looking forward to having you.
Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks for listening to The Doorstep, sponsored by the Carnegie Council for Ethics in International Affairs. For more, go to carnegiecouncil.org. Stay healthy and safe.